Whenever Master Hyakujō delivered a sermon, an old man was always there listening with the monks. When they left, he left too. One day, however, he remained behind. The master asked him, "What man are you standing in front of me?" The old man replied, "Indeed, I am not a man. In the past, in the time of Kāshyapa Buddha, I lived on this mountain as a Zen priest. On one occasion, a monk asked me, 'Does a perfectly enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect or not?' I answered, 'He does not.' Because of this answer, I fell into the state of a fox for 500 lives. Now, I beg you, Master, please say a turning word on my behalf and release me from the body of a fox." Then he asked, "Does a perfectly enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect or not?" The master answered, "The law of cause and effect cannot be obscured." Upon hearing this, the old man immediately became deeply enlightened. Making his bows, he said, "I have now been released from the body of the fox, and will be behind the mountain. I dare to make a request of the master. Please perform my funeral as you would for a deceased priest." The master had the Ino strike the anvil with a gavel and announce to the monks that after the meal there would be a funeral service for a deceased priest. The monks wondered, saying, "All are healthy. No one is sick in the infirmary. What's this all about?" After the meal, the master led the monks to the foot of a rock behind the mountain and, with his staff, poked out the dead body of a fox. He then performed the ceremony of cremation. That evening, the master ascended the rostrum in the hall and told the monks the whole story. Baku thereupon asked, "The man of old missed the turning word and fell to the state of a fox for 500 lives. Suppose every time he answered he made no mistakes. What would happen then?" The master said, "Just come nearer and I'll tell you." Baku then went up to the master and slapped him. The master clapped his hands and, laughing aloud, said, "I thought the barbarian's beard was red, but here is a barbarian with a red beard." Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Kōan Series. In the Kōan Series, we will read and discuss famous koans used by real Buddhist monks from such sources as the Blue Cliff Record, the Gateless Gate, the Treasury of the True Dharma Eye, and many others. As you will remember, over-intellectualizing koans is completely anathema to how they are used and ought to be used in real Buddhist practice, so keep that disclaimer in mind. However, I'm here to give some extra context and meaning to some of these koans so that you might see them in a new light and gain some new or deeper meaning from them than you did before. I hope you enjoy. This week we will be discussing the very long and complicated koan known in English as Hyakujō and the Fox. This koan is far longer than any other that we've discussed so far, and it is regarded among Zen thinkers themselves as being very difficult. As you can see, there's a lot going on here. There's a fox, a very important animal in Japanese and Chinese folklore. There is karma and rebirth. There is mention of barbarians with red beards, and more. We'll have a lot of threads to pull apart for this one. This koan is the second case in the Yamada Koun translation of the Gateless Gate, known as the Wumenguan in Chinese, or the Mumonkan in Japanese. Let's get to it. Sometimes koans have a koan inside of them, which is fascinating to think about. Many are too short for them to obviously present a koan within a koan, but as we've seen before, you can break up koans even down to the individual word, or the implied silence that follows the end of the case. The koan inside of the koan here is, quote, "Does a perfectly enlightened person fall under the law of cause and effect or not?" I answered, "He does not. Because of this answer, I fell into the state of a fox for 500 lives." Unquote. This is one of the most important lines in the entire case because it contains the implication of a misunderstanding of causality and karma. Even though the man who was reborn as a fox for 500 lives used to preach in the time of Kāshyapa, he still got the answer to this question so wrong that he was reborn into the body of a fox for 500 lives. We can't even conceive of that length of time. In our world, a fox lives for about 3 to 4 years, so 500 fox lives is 1,500 to 2,000 years. That's how long Christianity has existed on Earth. It is a very long time. If we take the lifespan of mythical foxes into account, the number gets much larger. A mythical fox can live for up to 800 or so years, meaning that 500 lifetimes would equate to 400,000 years. Additionally, the fox plays a very specific and unique role in East Asian folklore. There is a great deal of myth and legend concerning foxes and their role in the world of the divine, and so it is truly no mistake that the man was reborn as a fox. Then, on top of all of that, we have a funeral, we have the dialogue, we have the slapping of the master, and we have the barbarian with the red beard comment. If the koan wasn't confusing enough before, it becomes even more confusing during these parts. In order to unpack the meaning of this koan, we will be discussing causality and karma in Zen. We will be discussing foxes in East Asian folklore. We will talk about the red-bearded barbarians, and we will talk about the relationship between enlightenment and causality. Let's begin with karma and causality in Zen. We have talked extensively about how karma and causality function on the path of enlightenment. Basically, good begets good and bad begets bad, so it is incumbent upon each of us to cultivate good, purify bad, and thus proceed ever closer to enlightenment, to Buddhahood. Enlightenment and Buddhahood are typically regarded as states which are free from karma and causality because they're states which are the result of all of your accumulated good karma. By accumulating enough good karma, you can defeat and overcome the system itself and thus be free from it. By learning how to drive the car, you can finally drive to a good place and get out of the car and stay there. In older Buddhism, whenever you reach enlightenment, you are soon to reach nirvana, and no longer will you be a part of the cycle of samsara, which is entirely predicated on cause and effect. You'll remember that the 12 stages of dependent origination, which explain how sentient beings continue to be reborn in samsara, begins with ignorance as its first original cause, and reaching enlightenment erases that cause, and thus cuts off the other 11 states of arising. Thus, how enlightened beings can be free from causality makes sense. However, in this koan, the old man recounts how he fell into the realm of animals for 500 lives for claiming just that. That would make it seem like this koan claims that enlightenment and Buddhahood are not states which are free from karma and causality. I'm not so certain that the old man becoming a fox conclusively means that he was wrong, but we will get to that later. What is important for us to consider at this stage is how Buddhahood and enlightenment could actually be within the realm of causality. This is not a difficult thing to conceive of. If they are truly states of being which are the result of your good actions, then they are absolutely part of the cause and effect system. They are the resultant effects of positive causes in the past. However, we need to remember two very important doctrines in Zen that problematize such linear and black and white ways of thinking about the path. First off, we need to think of original enlightenment in its context as being a cause rather than an effect. Original enlightenment, as we have said before, is the doctrine that we are all originally enlightened, but that we fall from that state and must return to it through meditation, study, and practice. This study and practice should not be thought of as a forward process where we are practicing and doing good stuff now so that we can have something good in the future, but rather as a backward process, where we are returning to our original state and purifying our past bad actions to reclaim something that we once had. Original enlightenment as a cause rather than as an effect is captured in the other koan, without thinking of your parents, can you show me your original face? In that koan, it is driving home the point that original enlightenment is not something that is a destination, but rather an origin point. Therefore, if we think of enlightenment, our original and default state, as a cause, then what is the effect downstream? The answer is the second doctrine I wanted to speak about, which is the salvation of all sentient beings. The practice of the Bodhisattva path is imagined here as the result of original enlightenment. Thus, instead of the path having the goal of enlightenment and then subsequently nirvana, the goal here is actually to save all sentient beings everywhere, and the way we realize that is, at first, stepping backwards, not stepping forwards. And the enlightenment that we get to is not the end point, but rather the beginning point. Thus, enlightenment, bodhisattvahood, and Buddhahood are all firmly a part of the system of causality. Buddhas and bodhisattvas make use of causality to save and teach sentient beings everywhere. That's why the Master says, cause and effect cannot be obscured. It's too important to the goal of saving sentient beings everywhere to ignore. So why was the old man reborn as a fox 500 times for saying that enlightened beings are free from causality? Before we can answer that, we need to talk about foxes in East Asian folklore. Foxes first pop up in Chinese folklore, where they are recorded in the Classic of Mountains and Seas, or the Shanhai Jing. This is a compilation of myths and legends, and its origins go back as far as the 4th century BCE. It creates a very fascinating cosmology that describes mythical geography and mythical beasts and spirits that populate the world. One of these mythical characters is the famous nine-tailed fox, known in Chinese as the Juwei-hu, or in Japanese as the Kumiho. In this text, the fox is described as being very auspicious and positive, but also with the potential for being a man-eater. In later texts, the fox is described as having the ability to shapeshift and trick people with sexual temptations so that they can poison or bewilder them. There is one account from the Lun Hung, a text with myth commentaries and discussions of natural philosophy by the ancient scholar Guo Pu, who lived in the 3rd and 4th century CE, where he describes foxes thus, quote, "When a fox is 50 years old, it can transform itself into a woman. When 100 years old, it becomes a beautiful female or a spirit medium or an adult male who has sexual intercourse with women. Such beings are able to know things at more than 1,000 miles distance. They can poison men by sorcery, or possess and bewilder them, so that they lose their memory and knowledge. And when a fox is 1,000 years old, it ascends to heaven and becomes a celestial fox." Unquote. This is one of the earliest accounts of them being tricksters with potentially dangerous powers and motives. Now we should talk about fox spirits in Japanese myth, sometimes referred to as kitsune. Kitsune and fox spirits are actually not entirely the same. Kitsune are only one type of fox spirits, but there are also others. This category is very rich and diverse, but the majority of these spirits are trickster spirits who can shapeshift, who are very intelligent, who have command of magical powers, and who are sometimes servants and messengers of gods in Shinto. That they are shapeshifters explains why the fox presents himself as an old man to the master Hyakujō. There is too much about them in other traditions to talk about now, but we should mention how they are thought of in Buddhism. Because of their nature as being sexual tempters, they are a symbolic or a shorthand representation of the idea of temptation that young or low-level monks are particularly susceptible to. Thus, in this koan, the old man becomes reborn as a tempter for 500 lives. Remember how I said that I did not envision this as a punishment or an indication that he was wrong to say that enlightened beings are free from causality? My reason for thinking this has to do with the fact that older Buddhism agrees with his assessment. I think the koan wants us to think that agreeing with older Buddhism and its assessment is an easy and tempting mistake to make, and though it is wrong, it is only about 60% wrong. Foxes have a great deal of magical power, intelligence, and longevity, indicating that it would be better to be born as a fox than, say, a cockroach. If he had been born as a rat or a preta for 500 lifetimes, that would have been a much more negative connotation, and I would have thought, this is clearly a punishment for being so wrong. Because he was reborn as a fox, instead, he still had the capacity to be corrected and to achieve a new realization, whereas a preta would not have had that capacity. Foxes are tempters, and it is indeed easy and tempting to think of the path as a linear, forward process with an endpoint called enlightenment, due to the nature of language and due to the relatively simplistic presentations of the path in the earlier texts. But as I said before, Chan and Zen challenge us to think differently. Now let's briefly speak about the discovery of the fox's dead body and the subsequent funeral. Why did the old man request a priest's funeral? Well, it's because he had reached enlightenment, and he knew that the master had seen that. There are layers as to why he reached enlightenment right in that moment. On the one level, he heard the meaning of what was said, and it caused him to have a deep realization. Something shifted into place for him. On another level, he was aware that he was experiencing the stream of cause and effect, where the cause was the master's words, and the effect was his own enlightenment, causing him to realize that in truth, cause and effect cannot be ignored. So on whatever level you look at this, he reached enlightenment as a direct result of what the master said to him, and the master knew this and gave him a cremation with the monks gathered to honor him. That brings us to the dialogue between Hyakujō and Obaku. Obaku says, what if he hadn't answered incorrectly? Would he have been reborn as a fox 500 times? And Hyakujō says, come closer and I'll tell you. Then, Obaku, in blatant violation of the conventional teacher-student relationship, slaps him. This makes Hyakujō very happy, and he calls Obaku a red-bearded barbarian. This bit is like a whole other koan in itself. It is so jam-packed with potential points of analysis that I struggle to even know where to begin. Let's start with the issue of red-bearded barbarians. It is a bit of an open question as to who or what this refers to. One interpretation is that it refers to Bodhidharma, the founder of all jhana Buddhism. He had a beard, and he was either Indian or Central Asian, so his skin and hair colors were different from Chinese or Japanese people. We've also talked about how he was a well-known martial artist, and how he had cut off his own eyelids, so they affectionately referred to him sometimes as a red-bearded barbarian. He would look like any unshaved and vicious man you might pass on the road, but when you are actually in the know, when you have the enlightened eye, you realize that he is one of the most spiritually advanced men in all of history. Per that interpretation, Hyakujō is actually complimenting his student when he calls him a red-bearded barbarian, saying that he's presenting himself and presenting the issue of causality in a simplistic fashion, but really there is something profound and subtle to realize beneath that veneer. Because Hyakujō can see that there is this subtle realization beneath the surface, we see him compliment his student by calling him Bodhidharma. But why does Obaku slap his master? This bit gets pretty fascinating as well. I've seen an interpretation out there that Obaku saw that he was close enough that he could be whacked by Hyakujō, either with his whacking stick or his hand, and realizing what Hyakujō wanted to do, he slapped him instead. He got ahead of the game and beat Hyakujō to the punch, pun intended. This interpretation presents yet more questions. Why did Hyakujō want to slap his disciple? We've talked extensively about how slaps, shouts, and other seemingly random acts were used to elicit a satori experience. It seems that just like Hyakujō caused the fox's enlightenment, thus demonstrating how enlightenment and bodhisattvahood are firmly part of causality, he intended to cause Obaku to have the same realization with a slap or a whack. This suffices as an answer to the monk's question. If the foxman had not been wrong about the relationship between causality and enlightenment, he would have had his satori experience. He would have woken up in a sudden and shocking manner, similar to how one is understood to wake up in Zen when slapped or whacked. In response, Hyakujō was impressed. That slap told him that Obaku could see what was coming, and therefore he knew the answer, and he was possibly performing this dialogue to show that he had the deep and profound knowledge that enlightenment and causality were interrelated inseparably, and that he knew the answer to his own question. This is what elicited the compliment of calling him a red barbarian from Hyakujō. Now that we have discussed this case in some detail, let's jump into Mumon's commentary, and then we can sum up our discussion of the whole case. Mumon writes, quote, "Not falling under the law of cause and effect, for what reason had he fallen into the state of a fox? The law of cause and effect cannot be obscured. For what reason has he been released from a fox's body? If in regard to this you have the one eye, then you will understand that the former Hyakujō enjoyed 500 lives of grace as a fox." Unquote. This commentary captures and sums up everything we've been discussing here. In the first sentence, Mumon challenges us to understand that the old man was wrong, that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are free from causality, by highlighting the exact problem that such a way of thinking presents in the context of original enlightenment. The old man, like all sentient beings, is possessed of original enlightenment. So if he was free from causality, if such a thing was possible, then how could he possibly have been reborn as a fox as a result of his sin of answering the question wrongly? Then he turns it the other way and says if cause and effect cannot be obscured, how could Hyakujō have caused him to be released from his form as a fox? Here Mumon is challenging us to reconcile something. If causality cannot be obscured and is indeed absolute, how could this state of being a fox be reversed? The answer is the same as in the first portion. Enlightenment is the cause here, not the effect or the result. Thus, these two portions capture the opposite ends of the spectrum of understanding causality. It is not so trivial as to think that it can be tossed away on a whim by enlightened beings. But it is also not so absolute that nothing can change in the world. Mumon tells us that if we see in between these points of view, if we have the one eye that sees the middle way, then we can understand why the man was a fox for 500 lives. Interestingly, Mumon also thinks that the fox was actually Hyakujō in a distant past life. That's why he says, then you'll understand why the former Hyakujō enjoyed 500 lives of grace as a fox. This is really fascinating because it turns this entire thing into a bottle episode. It makes it so that the whole story essentially takes place within the confines of a single sentient being. So, the fox character was Hyakujō from the distant past, and the latter Hyakujō was the master who got slapped by Obaku. I don't think that the koan itself has enough information to conclusively say whether Mumon is right to say this, but I don't think that's the point. I think Mumon is further trying to drive home the middle way understanding of causality. These changes, these causes and effects, all took place along a single string of cause and effect within one single being's karmic history. That is a very fascinating way to understand this koan. It speaks to how, due to non-self and non-duality, this is my story and your story and the story of every sentient being as well. We are each and every one of the characters in this koan, even if they are all the same character at different times and stages of enlightenment. All in all, this is an extremely packed koan with a lot to talk about and a lot to realize through sustained thought and study. As I always mention, this is not how koans are used or ought to be used, and I'm just providing context and supporting information for you as you think about it. You're welcome to come up with your own interpretations and come to your own conclusions. Send them in, and I may call you a red-bearded barbarian. This has been episode 10 of the Kōan series. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has meant Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or find us on Mastodon at brightbuddhism@mstdn.party. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.